I'm delighted to be here today in Paris at the Institute of Advanced Studies. My name is Anne-Charlotte Martineau. I am a legal scholar and the co-director of le Centre de théorie et d'analyse du droit. I am here today to engage with Mathilde Cohen, who's a law professor at the University of Connecticut. We're here to engage with her work and her research here as a fellow at the Institute. So we will be talking about a very special type of food, namely human milk. Mathilde, why study human milk?
I'm fascinated with human milk because it is humans' primary food, and it is an essential food particularly for premature and sick babies. So just in France, there are about 7% of births are premature birth. That's about 55,000 babies a year. On the global scale, it's more around 10%, 13 million babies. So 13 million babies are born prematurely every year, and these babies have difficulties latching and nursing at the breast, and it's hard for their parents to produce milk. So human milk is absolutely essential as a food and as a therapy, as a drug, as a medicine, and also as a form of symbolic transmission. And not just for premature babies but also for other babies who might have conditions who really benefit from human milk. So to answer your question, I'm fascinated with human milk because it's a central food, but it's also so many other things. It's a drug, it's a therapeutic, and it's also a relationship, a liquid bridge, as anthropologist Tanya Cassidy says, for example.
Okay, that's really interesting. But what does the law have to do with all of that?
Absolutely, I understand. You don't immediately think that law and human milk are connected, but actually laws and policies are essential to people's abilities to have successful, healthy pregnancies, to lactate, and to produce sufficient milk to donate extra milk for premature babies. What actually first piqued my interest as a law professor is that I heard about families exchanging human milk in the United States. And I thought, oh, isn't that so interesting? How is human milk regulated? Is it regulated in the same way as animal milk, as plant milk? And I realized that there were ways in which human milk was hyper-regulated and ways in which it was under-regulated. So in some ways, law is everywhere around lactation and human milk, because if you don't have healthcare laws, insurance laws, work laws, all sorts of social mechanisms allowing parents to produce milk and breastfeed successfully, this is not a bodily fluid that can be produced. It requires having a flexible work schedule or being on leave for work, having competent advice and support and emotional and economic support, etc. So that's one aspect of the role of the law. And the second is, as soon as a society organizes a system of donor human milk, of collecting milk from donors, centralizing it into typically a medicalized institution called a human milk bank. In France, they're called Lactarium, and then distributing it to babies who need it, you need these laws or regulations to support these institutions and this distribution. And France is a very interesting case because it is, from my research, the country that has started regulating human milk banks the first. It started in the 1930s, actually in 1936, the first socialist government called the Front Populaire was the first government in the history of France where 3 women had cabinet positions at a time where French women didn't have the right to vote. And Suzanne Lacan was health secretary, undersecretary, and she issued administrative regulations to support the circulation of human milk. And what's so interesting is that they put in place a sort of proto-reproductive justice system. So she was very careful to ensure that poor families, babies from poor families, abandoned babies, babies from single mothers, from migrant mothers, would have access to donor human milk if they needed it for free, that the donors would be paid a living wage, and that the state would fund the system, but also that wealthy families would buy the milk if they needed it, and thereby supporting with private funds, supplementing this public system.
What I found really interesting in what you say is that it started as a left project, and it started as a radical project in a way, geared towards maybe the poorest fraction of the population. So how did the legal system evolve, especially, for instance, during the Second World War? Did it stop? What happened?
So thank you so much. So you're absolutely right that the regulation of human milk banks starts with the Front Populaire in 1936, and it is really an egalitarian legal project. But the actual idea of obtaining milk from donors, processing it, and then distributing it to babies is much older. It started in the mid to late 19th century when French obstetricians, in particular in Paris, decided that they had to do something to save premature babies, and that finally they had the technique they needed, incubators, couveuses, and the technique of gavage, which consists in transmitting human milk to a baby who cannot suckle it through the nose or through the mouth directly. And so initially the system that was primarily geared at premature babies was expanded in particular to abandoned babies. Many babies were abandoned, and at that time there was no safe alternative to human milk. And so these babies had to be fed human milk to increase their life expectancy, but there was also transmissible diseases such as syphilis. So if an orphan would nurse on the breast of a wet nurse, the wet nurse could be contaminated, or the babies. So disembodying human milk, creating bottles of human milk was a way to avoid that problem. So this was not yet legalized, but it was already at the time an emancipatory project in some ways, in that the goal was really to save babies, and particularly vulnerable, marginalized babies. On the other hand, as I show in my work, the donors themselves were not always treated in the best conditions because they were considered wet nurses at that time, and wet nursing it depended what type of wet nurse you were, but wet nursing has a long history of being an exploitative profession, even if for some wet nurses this was actually a pretty good way to make a living, so it's hard to generalize.
The type of women changed over time. Can you say a bit more about who these women were?
Absolutely, yes. So what's fascinating to me is how there's a major transformation in the pool of milk donors from the late 19th century until the late 20th century and the 21st century, because my research is also interested in present-day Lactarium or human milk banks. So at the beginning of the period, they were considered wet nurses, and most wet nurses, especially hospital wet nurses, as opposed to wet nurses who would maybe be salaried by a very bourgeois family. So hospital wet nurses were typically young, impoverished, rural, migrant, single women who fled to Paris, hiding their pregnancies, and had very few options to survive. So these hospitals would take them in French, intern them, and tell them, look, we're going to give you a room and board, and you can be here with your own baby, so you don't have to abandon your own baby. But in exchange for your room, your board, and a salary, you'll have to share some of your milk with the hospitalized babies. So it was considered at the time a sort of win-win situation by public health and legal authorities. The idea was like, we're facing a crisis of infant mortality in France. We're facing a crisis of abandonment of children. So by taking in these women, we're preventing them from abandoning their own children. We're paying them, in some cases, teaching them how to be proper mothers. We're educating them into proper motherhood, teaching them how to knit, how to sew, how to care for children, and we're saving these orphaned and sick babies. But throughout the 20th century, you see an evolution, particularly after the Second World War. After the Second World War, the institution is reborn into a modern human milk banks where the donors are no longer in the hospitals. The donors are people who live in their own houses, apartments, wherever, and who express milk at home typically. And the milk bank sends collectors to their homes to retrieve the milk and bring it back to the milk bank. And throughout the second part of the 20th century into the 21st century, you see that the donors become increasingly upper class, married women who have much more economic and cultural capital. And in part, it makes sense because we know that if at the beginning of the period, the people who tended to breastfeed were typically the marginalized, throughout the 20th century, breastfeeding becomes a practice that is more prevalent among the haves than the haves not. And in great part, this is because upper class married women have the time and economic power and medical support and community support to be able to breastfeed. And as we know, breastfeeding is not a cost-free activity. It's not easy. It has an opportunity cost. It requires a lot of know-how. So I don't want to overgeneralize because in every group of societies, people breastfeed, but by and large, it has become easier for privileged people to breastfeed, which is also why today not all donors come from this background, but a much greater share than initially.
So you said that at the beginning, the women giving milk, expressing their milk, were being given a stipend. Is it still the case today?
Thank you for asking that, because this question of whether or not donors are paid for their milk is central to the evolution of human milk banking, not only in France, but internationally, because it's a real debate people are having, not only about human milk, but about other bodily fluids and products, organs, tissues, gametes, blood, etc. Should donors get paid? Should they absolutely not get paid? If they're paid, how much, etc. So because donors grew out of wet nurses, and wet nursing was a recognized profession at the beginning of the period, absolutely, you were a salaried milk donor in a hospital, typically. And some donors actually were able to make quite a bit of money helping them, you know, to build a career after that. And in fact, what's fascinating in a country such as France, in which the official narrative is one of anti-commodification, is one that says, you know, French law thinks the dignity of the human person and the body is paramount, and the understanding of dignity is that dignity is incompatible with commerce and being paid. Well, French milk donors were typically paid until 1992. So that's quite recently. Until 30 years ago, donors were paid. So legally, what's interesting to me is that initially, what you see is a contract of employment in the case of the wet nurse that is transformed into a fee you were paid by the litter. And in fact, still today, the French government sets up the price of human milk. Right now, the French law says that 1 liter of human milk is worth 80 euros when it's in fluid form. and 133 euros for 100 grams when it's in powdered form. So what my research tries to explain is why is milk treated differently than blood and organs and gametes, for which in France no compensation is allowed. And I have lots of theories, in part this genealogy in the wet nursing profession. But I have other hypotheses, but it's definitely an interesting example of commodification of a bodily product that was accepted until recently.
Yeah, and so what happened in 1992? Was there a debate, a public debate, or a debate within the parliament? Who decided to stop financing or commodifying milk, human milk?
So in the early 1990s, public officials, medical officials began saying we need bioethics laws. And so representatives at the National Assembly, at the Senate, but also all sorts of experts and bureaucrats at the Ministry of Health and other ministries began thinking about these bioethics laws known as the Loi de Bioéthique, and the first one was enacted in 1994. But leading up to that, there was a big debate behind the scenes, so it wasn't very public, because no one was thinking about human milk at the time. People were really interested in regulating reproductive technologies primarily, even though I think that human milk is part of reproductive justice and rights. I see the link, but at the time that wasn't a very public link. And so in the archives, so there was a real debate. Shall we include human milk among these other bodily fluids or products or not? And in 1992, the majority of the stakeholders were leaning in favor, and they issued a regulation saying from now on, public institutions, medical institutions can no longer compensate donor human milk. And the other factor was the HIV epidemic. Even though human milk was always very safe in France because it was always pasteurized, so even before wide HIV testing was available, the French human milk banks had really safe human milk. There was this whole narrative around the idea that it would make the product safer if the producers were not paid, in part inspired by the work of Richard Titmuss, who's an English scholar who had written about this in the context of blood.
Okay, interesting. You mentioned earlier that there were two different amount, or that the milk was valued differently if it was in a way fresh milk or freeze-dried. Is that correct? Am I understanding correctly that there's actually freeze-dried human milk?
I know, this is really a strange idea, right? That our own bodily fluids, especially human milk, which culturally is constructed as very intimate,
exactly,
private, that it would be freeze-dried or lyophilized, like the coffee you might make when you go camping, or a miso soup you pour water into. Well, yes, you understood correctly. France is actually a very interesting case study because this is a country where publicly funded milk banks or public milk banks have produced freeze-dried, lyophilized human milk nonstop since the 1950s. Yes.
The 1950s.
I know. Actually, it all started because the French human milk bank created after Second World War at the Institut de Puériculture was led by a young pharmacist named Jacqueline Bertrand, who was very ambitious, very interested in science and technologies, and her husband was very high-ranking, quite high-ranking in the French army. And she knew that the French army during Second World War had experimented with a new American military medicine product, which was lyophilized plasma. So what is lyophilized plasma? It's a part of the blood that gets freeze-dried because it allows blood transfusion very fast in places where you don't have refrigeration. And so during the war, it had been a key instrument of keeping troops alive or safer on the front. So in 1945, the French government says we need to develop our own plasma program, and the French government and the army invested in creating a network of blood banks that had the technology and the expertise to lyophilize blood. So Jacqueline Bertrand knew that and thought, how about we try this technology on milk? And so she experimented with the protocols and created her own protocol for human milk, and then disseminated it through French milk banks. And over the years, various French milk banks around France began producing freeze-dried milk. And one bank in particular, Marmande, in the south of France, became specialized in freeze-dried human milk, and the largest human milk bank in France and in Europe. And today, the Marmande Milk Bank partnered in now fusion with the Bordeaux Milk Bank, and it is still producing lyophilized freeze-dried human milk.
This lyophilized milk, the state has it, so it's a state commodity, I'm guessing. Who owns it? It's the state, it's the Lactarium. So, but to whom is it intended?
So that's a very interesting question, because the Marmande Lactarium until the 2000s was actually managed by the Red Cross. Oh. So it was nonprofit but private. Now that it has merged with the Bordeaux Bank, it is a public milk bank. And there is a way in which we can think of human milk as being a national good, a national property. But why produce freeze-dried human milk? I think that's a great question. Initially, you have to think about it as both a technical and a political issue. So the technical issue is, in the 50s, most French people didn't have fridges, and even health institutions didn't necessarily have fridges or freezers, or at least not many. And human milk is a very fragile, perishable substance, which is why Jacqueline Bertrand thought, can we come up with a technique that will make it last longer? In fact, there were historical precedents. So in Vienna in the 1910s, there were some Viennese doctors who had already started powdering milk, or at MIT and in Boston in the 1920s, etc. But she didn't necessarily know that, but she thought, what can I do to make sure we can stock up on human milk and have it accessible everywhere in France if we have a very sick or premature baby and their parents cannot produce milk for that baby? So it's really about having a preservation technique and also having a backup in case of crisis. And it's been really helpful, for example, whenever there have been shortages or suspicion of contamination, say a bank, there's a suspicion that there's some bacteria. So during the time that bacteria is investigated, the babies in the hospital still get human milk in the form of lyophilized milk. But part of, I think, what happened also in the late 20th century, early 21st century, is that freeze-dried human milk became a way to send human milk in the French overseas territories. So France continued to have overseas territories outside of mainland France. And even though these territories know prematurity rates often double in the mainland France, until 2017, there were no milk banks over there. So the first French overseas milk bank opened in 2017 in Guyane, and the second in 2019 in Martinique, which means that the only way for premature babies born in these overseas territories to get human milk when their own parents couldn't or cannot produce milk was to get freeze-dried human milk. And in fact, the Marmande Milk Bank sells or ships an overwhelming proportion of its products to these overseas regions.
So that's very interesting what you say the development between, or the tension between mainland France and the overseas territories. So if you were today, let's say, the French Minister of Health, what would be your policies regarding human milk generally?
So I would love to be the Minister of Health if I had an unlimited budget, okay? Because I know if you have budget constraints, you can do much less. So first, just to talk about human milk banks, I would fund the human milk banks much more generously, because these are institutions that are chronically underfunded, understaffed, and the doctors and nurses and technicians I met there do a heroic job. Literally, they work overtime. They really try, they go above and beyond to help people who have difficulties expressing milk, to help babies, etc. So they do a fantastic job, and they need and deserve more money. But also, I would scale up the system so that more human milk is available in more regions and to more babies with broader indications, so that not just very premature babies have access to human milk, but all premature, all sick babies, or hospital babies. And even if we had sufficient milk for outpatient babies who for a reason or another need it. And so absolutely, I would go talk to the local communities, for example, in overseas region. In every overseas region, I would talk to the local communities and ask them, how do you want to organize a donor human milk system, right? How do you want the milk to circulate? How do you want the donors to be recruited? Who do you want to be in charge? So it would be a participatory process so that different communities, different localities in France would all have their donor human milk system that would be very accessible. And this is not just my imagination. So Brazil, for example, has 220 milk banks. And if you compare, France only has about 30, and the United States also only has 30. So why can Brazil do this when we cannot? And in Brazil, human milk banks are very low-tech, low-budget centers that double up as breastfeeding consultation centers. So if you have a breastfeeding problem in Brazil, my friends tell me, at 2 in the morning, apparently, you can go to or call a human milk bank, and there will be some very competent person comforting you, helping you, showing you. So that's amazing. That I would want all people living in French territories, mainland or overseas, to have that. And more generally, I would want more support for people who want to breastfeed to be able to breastfeed, because as we know, maternity leave in France is quite, I mean, it's better than in some places, but it's much shorter than in others. So I would want people who want a longer paid maternity leave to have a longer maternity leave. I would want people who need lactation consultants, which is everyone who tries to breastfeed, to have free and competent lactation support. Right now, it's often not reimbursed by the mutuelle and never by Social Security. I would want everyone who wants a high-quality breast pump to have one for free without having to rent it, without having to apply for it and go through a complicated process. And so I would want all these changes, making it much easier and cheaper for people to lactate, and making the institution that redistributes the milk better funded so it can serve all the children in France that need it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Well, thank you.